I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, when I heard a voice shouting from the driveway. "Step away from the vehicle." She wasn't even bothering to use her indoor voice. And by vehicle, she meant my truck, the one parked right in my own driveway on my own land. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. Was I hearing this right? It was Karen Halberton, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, and apparently the newly crowned enforcer of every little rule she could make up. She was storming toward me, clipboard in hand, those little designer dogs of hers barking furiously in their tiny HOA-branded hoodies, like they were guarding the crown jewels. Now, what she didn't know was that I wasn't just any random neighbor she could push around. I was the county sheriff. So when the cops showed up a little later, it wasn't to ask me to move my truck. They showed up to ask for my autograph. But the real trouble started with a little piece of paper. It was taped right to the windshield of my truck, a fluorescent orange violation notice, all bold letters screaming about how my vehicle was undermining the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I had to laugh, and I nearly spilled my coffee. My truck? An F-250, clean, civilian, and legally parked. It hadn't even moved in 2 days because I was actually taking a break for the first time in weeks. As I looked around, hoping I was just part of a joke, there was Karen marching down the street with her little designer dogs yapping like they were in a show. She pointed at my truck like she'd discovered a tank parked in a kindergarten. I took a slow sip of my coffee, raising an eyebrow, and gave her a polite nod. That only made her angrier. "You can't just park your command vehicle here like this," she yelled, waving her clipboard as if that alone could hand out tickets. "This is a residential neighborhood, not some police depot." I smiled back, gesturing to my driveway. Funny, I could have sworn this was my house. My truck, my driveway. Karen narrowed her eyes, sensing sarcasm, but too flustered to come up with anything clever. "You're clearly violating HOA regulations," she sniffed. "And don't try to lie your way out of it. We've had multiple complaints." I almost choked on my coffee at that. "I'd love to see those complaints," I said, already knowing what was going on. No one in the neighborhood had ever complained. In fact, they usually loved when I brought the truck home after the break-ins last fall. People felt safer with it around. But none of that mattered to Karen. She didn't care about facts. She cared about control. "You'll be getting a formal citation by the end of the day," she warned, scribbling in her notepad with the kind of dramatic flair that made me almost want to clap. "Shaking," I said, grinning. "Karen, you do what you've got to do." She glared at me and said, "You just wait. The authorities will hear about this. You'll regret messing with me." "Please," I said, "call the cops." And call them, she did. That night, as I was getting dinner ready, I heard a knock on the door. It was the patrol cruiser pulling up, and when I opened the door, Deputy Jameson grinned at me. "Got a real wild call on our hands, Sheriff," he said, tipping his hat. "Oh no," I said, playing along. "Should I be worried?" "Well, apparently there's an unidentified man in a suspicious military vehicle intimidating the neighborhood." We both laughed until I had to lean against the door for support. Karen was standing on the sidewalk, watching with a self-satisfied grin that disappeared the moment she saw us laughing. Jameson walked over to her, and with a nod toward me, he said, "Ma'am, this truck belongs to Sheriff Connors, the elected head of law enforcement for the entire county." Her mouth dropped open, then closed, then opened again, like someone who'd just seen a magic trick. She looked from me to my truck to the patrol car, trying to process what she was hearing. "You're joking," she hissed. "No, ma'am," Jameson said, pulling out a notepad. "But I'm going to need to take a report on false reporting of a public official. That's a Class B misdemeanor." Karen went pale. "Now, Sheriff," Jameson said, turning back to me, "do you mind signing this?" He pulled out a laminated newspaper clipping from an award I'd won last year. My nephew's a huge fan. Karen stood there, frozen, watching me sign the clipping. It could have ended there. Most people, after realizing they'd messed with the sheriff, might back off. But not Karen. She had a different ego, the kind that doesn't retreat, the kind that regroups. The very next morning, I found 3 new infractions posted to my door. One claimed I left my trash bins out for too long. Another said my garage lights were suspicious. And the third? A noise complaint for the mechanical activity of my electric smoker set on low. Seriously, Apparently, it was a disruptive machine. It wasn't just about the truck anymore. It was war, and Karen had no idea what was coming. By the end of the week, Karen's petty vendetta had gone from annoying to laughable. Every day, there was a new violation. One said my backyard barbecue smoke violated air quality regulations. Another claimed my fence didn't match the neighborhood's color palette. I nearly choked on my coffee when I saw that one. The fence hadn't been painted in years. It was the same weathered cedar it had been since the house was built. But what really got under my skin was that none of these notices were even official. She'd printed them herself and stamped them with the HOA's rubber stamp, one shaped like an eagle. It wasn't just me she was targeting. After a bit of digging, I found out she had a history of pettiness, disputes over lawn ornaments, unapproved patio chairs, even shutting down a kid's lemonade stand for unregulated commerce. I realized this wasn't just a Karen thing. This was a pattern. I started collecting evidence. Then, one afternoon, I ran into my neighbor, Mr. Delaney, a retired Navy man. We talked about Karen's latest antics, and when I told him what I was doing, he jumped right in. Soon, a few more neighbors were on board. Everyone had a story to tell, from fines for porch lights left on to disputes over flagpoles. But the real turning point came when I found out Karen had been threatening to put a lien on my property. That crossed the line. You can't just threaten to seize someone's home unless you have the authority to do so. And Karen had no such authority. She wasn't even legally running the HOA anymore. So I got to work. I sent Karen a cease and desist letter detailing her legal violations. But she didn't back down. No, she ramped it up. A week later, she had security guards installing cameras around the neighborhood, without any vote, without any notice to the residents. And, in a perfect stroke of irony, one of the guards broke the neighborhood's shared gate. I got all on video. It was time to strike back. The final blow came at the next HOA meeting, one that Karen had called in an attempt to reassert control. She had no idea what was coming. When she launched into her new set of ridiculous rules, I stood up calmly. "Madam President," I said, using the title she insisted on, "before we move forward, we need to address a few legal issues regarding the current board." The room went silent. I pulled out my folder and laid out the evidence. The HOA had been running illegally for years. They hadn't re-registered their nonprofit status. The board hadn't been elected in 3 years, and Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Karen's smug smile dropped. She tried to argue, but the room had already turned on her. Sharon, one of my neighbors, stood up and seconded the motion to dissolve the current board. And just like that, Karen's reign came crashing down. The meeting ended with Karen storming out in defeat. Outside, the neighborhood was buzzing. People weren't afraid anymore. They were empowered. It wasn't just a win. It was the moment we took our neighborhood back. But the best part came a few days later. Karen, in her arrogance, sued the entire neighborhood committee. I didn't even flinch when the lawsuit showed up on my doorstep. It was riddled with errors and nonsensical claims. A joke. The case went to court, and Karen lost. Fast. The judge practically laughed her out of the courtroom. But the fun didn't end there. Turns out, Karen had been using HOA funds for her own personal expenses. Embezzlement. Tax fraud. The state launched an investigation, and soon, she was under criminal investigation. The neighborhood threw a block party in celebration, and as I sat back in my chair, I realized something. Justice had been served, not just through a court ruling, but through the power of a community coming together, standing up for what's right. Karen may have tried to control us with her petty rules and power trips, but in the end, the real power was in the hands of the people who cared enough to fight back. And as for my truck, it's still parked right where it always was. Every now and then, I catch a neighbor admiring it. One even asked if they could take a picture next to it, saying it felt like a symbol now. I smiled and told them, "Sure, just don't block the mailbox. You never know who might be watching."